So we've reviewed the work of Hubel and Wiesel, which was foundational for the treatment of vision in a lot of um, cognitivist accounts, which understand perception as the construction of representations built on input using the vocabulary of information processing. Such representational models of perception provide us with a lot to think about, but they necessarily come with some caveats. We're just going to review some of them here. The first thing is that groundbreaking work that won the Nobel Prize was based on anesthetized cats. The internet's great, look at that picture. Anesthetized cats are a bit special. They're not normal cats. Normally a cat is awake and behaving, and vision is part of the means by which it engages with the world. There can be no meaningful engagement with the world from an animal in an anesthetized state. Interestingly, in 1981, David Hubel and Margaret Livingston produced a paper that really should cause us to relativize the original findings. The paper was called The Effects of Sleep and Arousal on the Processing of Visual Information in the Cat, so we haven't left that framework at all. But what they found was that it was now possible to remove the strong constraint of anesthetization. Technology for single neuron recordings was getting better. Titanium electrodes were changing the field. And what they found was that if the cat was awake, even a little bit awake, the response properties of the neurons changed dramatically. This means that any conclusions drawn about what those neurons are doing that were obtained from anesthetized cats are particular to anesthetized cats and do not generalize to an awake cat. And against that, we should pit an older study from the 1960s, which gives an awful lot of things to think about. This is the famous Held and Hine study. Movement-produced stimulation in the development of visually guided behavior. This was a very elaborate study in which 10 pairs of kittens were raised for, I forget how long, several months, in a very constrained environment. Specifically, they were kept in the dark a lot of the time, and when they were exposed to light, they were placed inside a cylindrical field attached, much like Samson in Gaza, attached to a central pillar with a pole coming from each end and one kitten dangling off each end of that pole. One of the kittens has its feet on the ground, and that's the kitten that's going to actually move the pole, while the other kitten is passive. It is suspended in a box, and the inside of the cylinder is fitted out with these starkly contrasting black and white lines, ensuring that the kind of visual stimulation that arises is more or less uniform no matter where you are as the entire gig rotates. So one of the kittens is doing all the work here, and they're both receiving, in as close as you can make it, identical visual stimulation. The results were very interesting. The kittens received more or less identical stimulation, but only one of them was actively moving as it was learning how to use its eyeballs. After several weeks of this, only the kitten who was active had really learned to see. There are various tests to see if a visual system in a cat is working normally. So if you approach a horizontal surface from above, take your cat and bring it down towards the table, it will put out its paws because it understands that a surface is coming up. If you put an object in front of its eyes, it will blink because it understands that that is in close spatial proximity. And the kitten who had done all the heavy lifting, who had done the walking, responded normally to these tests, while the passive kitten did not. It had, in many respects, failed to learn to see. So this might lead you to query any approach to vision in which the role of self-movement is neglected. Here, what we see is the inseparability of perception and action. That is, perception here is very difficult to understand as mere input. Rather, it's part of the story of how the kitten comes to establish some kind of cognitive control over its world. So that's very thought-provoking. Another problem which has given rise to a lot of discussion is known as the binding problem. You remember from Milner and Goodale that we had uncovered the dorsal and ventral streams, which seemed to show us neurons which were sensitive to different kinds of visual information. In the dorsal stream, we had sensitivity to motion, whether egocentric motion or motion from things without, while in the ventral stream, we had neurons that seemed to be more engaged in processes of recognition and identification. Now, we don't have two separate visual experiences. We see. And it's difficult to say what we see, but it doesn't seem to be two kinds of seeing. We can separate seeing from hearing, but I don't know that we can separate seeing as it applies to movement from seeing as it applies to recognizing. So the binding problem is that if we accept a dual stream model, how is it that vision seems to be a single modality? Now, there's been very many solutions proposed to this of different kinds, some rejecting the constructive representational framework, some trying to modify it and appeal to things such as long-range synchronization across neurons. We won't go into that, but you can see how any framing of perception runs into problems. But these computational approaches we've been looking at, while they are terrifically orthodox, they also are not the only way we can approach such questions. They are strongly internalist, neurocentric, focusing on what's going on in the brain, as if that was where such questions could be answered. And remember, we started all this with saying if mind is separate from world, then an account is needed of how mind comes to know world. And one way to approach this problem is to think of brain activity as coextensive with the mental, and to interpret what's going on in the brains then as the construction of representations. That whole school has the character of an optional approach. There are other ways to approach such things, and we mentioned relational accounts of perception, which examine instead the relationship between the ongoing activity of an organism and its environment. Remember, we said that the switch here is from asking what's going on in the head to asking what is the head inside of. And when we adopt a relational approach, it's precisely the kind of concerns that come out in the Held and Hine study that we are dealing with. That is, question of the unfolding of the activity of the organism and its dependence on patterns of change. And change is, of course, possible from me and from the world. So change is relational. And here, it's worth reminding ourselves that most work in perception has been done in the visual modality, and our understanding of the visual modality is complicated greatly by the fact that we live in an image-saturated culture with reliance on texts and all forms of visually mediated exchange of information, which are of very little use when it comes to understanding the brain as an organism. That is, as something which belongs in the theater of nature. We did not evolve in an image-saturated culture. And I suggested that one could envisage a switch from thinking of vision as being the theater in which we develop our intuitions about perception, and coming back to touch instead, because touch, as we said, is a necessary condition of any embodied being. And when we consider touch, it's worth asking ourselves, how do we find out about the world through touch? And here's a nice example. If I give you a sponge and I ask you, is it hard or is it soft? What'll you do? You'll pick it up and you'll squeeze it. And in so doing, you're generating patterns of change that inform you about the solidity, rigidity, elasticity, softness of the object. You don't do that passively. You have to generate those patterns. Now, this is an interesting characteristic of touch. It is an active modality in which we encounter the world in a reciprocal relationship. We push the world and the world pushes us back. Patterns of change arise that lead to our mastery of the world. Now, if we take this as our guiding intuition, we're driven to recognize that all perception is based on change. Change, as I said, can be self-generated. Change can arise from the world. Change speaks of the relationship of an organism to its world. It might not be clear to you that vision also has this character. Indeed, it's sometimes difficult to remind ourselves of this, but change is a necessary condition for vision, just as much as for touch. And this is a point at which the analogy between the camera and anything in the visual system breaks down. The point at which we recognize the eyeball is just part of a visual system. It's the system we're trying to understand, and there is nothing like a visual system in a camera. Now, if the eyes were cameras, motion would be a problem to be overcome. But in fact, the eyes are always in motion. There are many kinds of eye movement, and we'll go through the different kinds of eye movement that are involved. Not only eye movement, of course, but body movement and movement of things in the world. The visual field is a source of change. It's very difficult to undo this. It is possible to build a tiny little projector and mount it on the eyeball and project a static image onto the retina. If you do that, seeing stops. So a static image on the retina is not a stimulus for seeing. It does not support seeing. We can illustrate this. I'm not sure this is going to work very well because you're viewing this on your computer. But if you will, reassure yourself first that in this display there is a central black dot and a penumbra or surround of grey. Now, back off from your computer to about 1.5 meters away and stare at the black dot, and stare at it until the grey disappears. And when the grey disappears, then move your eyes and note that the grey comes back. Stare at the dot and the grey disappears. Move your eyes and the grey comes back. Now the dot remains persistent because it's a very high contrast element, and therefore the visual system is very sensitive to it. The surrounding grey penumbra is detail, which requires a bit more work to attend to. And in this manner, we can make ourselves aware of the fact that change in the direction of vision, change in how we cast our gaze, is a central part of vision, and that vision is anything other than the registration of static images.